So before I kind of get into what I thought was important of the text, I just want to kind of get a general consensus of what you guys felt about the reading. You liked the reading, did not like the reading, disturbed, confused, any just general conversations about the reading. Nothing too detailed, but just kind of want to get a consensus of how y'all felt about it.
Well, I thought the reading was very interesting. Some parts were kind of confusing and concerning, and I had to like go over them again.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't like, I don't think it was so hard reading like some of the previous ones.
Yeah, I think the reading, to me at least, right, it wasn't as dense, it wasn't as like opaque like Blisson or some of the previous reads that we had, but it's difficult in the sense of the material and that we're engaging, like the content that he's discussing is uncomfortable, it's difficult, it's disturbing, at least for me, but I want to get some other thoughts. What did you guys think about the read? Has anyone heard? Go ahead, Samantha. Go ahead.
Oh, I kind of liked it mainly because it showed like the perspective of the white person, because usually you read a book and it's talking about the black person's perspective and like what they went through, but they never really talk about like the mindset that the other side had.
Yeah, that's true. And especially if you think about it coming from James Baldwin, who is a black man, right? So he's a black man writing from the mindset of a white man, which is interesting. Anybody else want to comment?
I thought the reading was like kind of pretty disturbing towards the end. Well, in part two.
Yeah.
And it just like it gave me a sense of like how it was back then, sort of.
Yeah.
Like how things were run, how racism was like a big like factor.
Yeah.
In history, especially.
And I would argue, Douglas, that it continues to this day. That hasn't changed too much, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Two questions. Has anybody heard of the term a visceral reaction or a visceral response to something? No. If anybody watches like HBO, there's a show called Lovecraft Country. Has anybody watched that? Okay, Miracle. So like that show produces a very visceral response. Like you watch some shit and you feel that in your gut, right? Like some scenes that your body responds to it. James Baldwin is an author that produces a visceral, effective response for his readers. And I think you see that play out very well in this text. Has anybody heard of James Baldwin prior to reading this text? Yeah. Miracle, what's your familiarity with Baldwin?
Well, I had to learn about him in English class last year, I think it was, and we just read a lot of his books to go over, I don't know, his perspective on racism and how his books changed the viewpoint of how a lot of people view racism, really, and how it still is today.
Absolutely. So for me personally, James Baldwin is my all-time favorite writer. The descriptive nature of his writing to me sets him apart from any of his contemporaries or anybody really writing today. There's a detail in his analysis and his critique that you don't find in a lot of other authors. There's this idea of his ability to displace his readers, right? So, I could be reading this book from Claremont, but as I read the text, I find myself in Harlem, right? I find myself in the bedroom of Jesse. I find myself on his father's shoulders, right? He places you as a reader where he wants you to go. And I think that's something that is very specific, to Baldwin in the way that he writes. So let's talk about what I found of interest in the text. So one, the story comes from this book titled Going to Meet the Man, which is, of course, also the title of the story that we read. It's a collection of 9 short stories, right? So when you talk about method, we have to address the fact that this is a story, right? It's not a letter, it's not an essay, it's not a novel, but a story. So what is the significance of the story? What does the story allow you to do as a writer juxtaposed to what an essay may allow you to do? right? How can a story, or what role can a story play in producing knowledge or producing an understanding, right? These are some of the questions that I kind of thought about as I engaged this. How effective is Baldwin's use of story? Does he kind of allow you, through his use of story, to get an understanding of what he wants you to understand, right? What is Baldwin trying to get you to understand in this particular story, right? So it's two conversations. It's like a broader understanding of what stories do, and then what is this particular story doing, and what is Baldwin doing with this particular story? Okay, so I know Miracle says she's familiar with Baldwin, and I don't know if this was addressed, but for those who are not familiar with Baldwin, when you talk about Baldwin and you talk about engaging Baldwin, I think it's important to understand what I call the Baldwinian understanding of white supremacy. And I'm going forward, I'm not going to refer to it as white supremacy because that's not what it is. It's truly a system of white inferiority, right? So I will be referring to white supremacy as white inferiority. But Baldwin gives us two pillars of white inferiority. What does a pillar do? What is the purpose of a pillar? Think about the Roman Colosseums. They were famous for their pillars. What is the importance of a pillar? What is it designed to do?
Support.
To support or to hold something up. So we're talking about the two pillars of white inferiority. And in Baldwin's estimation, it's the white imagination is one pillar, and the second pillar is the maintenance of white innocence, right? So maintaining this idea or maintaining this notion of white innocence. And this is how these two pillars play out, right? So you think about the white imagination, to me, one of the clearest depictions of the white imagination is Hollywood, right? What are movies, right? Who runs Hollywood, right? So a couple years ago, there was the whole hashtag Oscars so white, right? Detailing and critiquing the pervasiveness of whiteness in the Hollywood space, right? So also Hollywood produces images and tropes about cultures that the world views and perceives to be true, right? Has anybody seen or heard of the film by D.W. Griffin, Birth of a Nation? No. So I'm not sure, not Miracle. Valeria, if you could kind of explain to the class the premise of Birth of a Nation.
I actually watched it like years ago.
Okay. Just what you can remember, now fill in the gaps. No. So essentially the premise is the time of the film is set in like a Reconstruction or post-Reconstruction era, right? And so with that being said, some things like Black people occupying office is a theme in the film, right? And the way that they're portrayed in the office, their feet are on the desk, their shoes are off, they're eating copious amounts of fried chicken and having watermelon, right? And they're just depicted in this very buffoonish characteristic and trope, right? So part of the problems is now that we have these Black folks in office due to Reconstruction, due to the fact that Black people are able to vote, the moral fabric of the society is beginning to subside, right? So also among this story that's being told is there's an attempt to rape a white woman, and in her attempts to flee the rape, she throws herself off of a mountain, right? And this causes rise to mass hysteria, which eventually gives rise to the Ku Klux Klan. And the movie ends with the Klan essentially going on a terroristic ride through the town, burning and pillaging and killing Black folks, right? So one, this movie is celebrated for its technological advancements, right? The way that the film was shot, the cinematography of the film is above its time. But then also from a cultural standpoint, this film was like shown in the White House. This film was like brought on tour throughout the eastern part of the country, right? Not in the South, but on the East Coast, right? This film went on tour. And in lieu of this, the Ku Klux Klan's numbers begin to uprise, and you see a spike in Klan activity, right? So I lay this out to show you guys the way that film can inform society, right? So again, prior to the film being released, Klan activity has been reduced. The film gets released, the film gets shown in the White House, the film gets placed on tour, and Klan activity picks up, okay? Also, this idea of the image of Blackness, right? The desire to rape and the desire to have an insatiable need for white women, right? Gets depicted and gets placed in the mind of the white imagination, right? So now this notion of Black men desiring white women becomes a trope, okay? So I was born in the 90s. Sorry, I'm not born in the 90s. I grew up in the 90s. I was born in the 80s, grew up in the 90s. So part of a vast majority of Black culture in the 90s or Black film in the 90s portrayed the gangster role, right? So you think about Boys in the Hood, you think about Menace to Society, you think about all the films that came out in that era, right? Depicted a certain trope about Black men, right? Think about the music that subsided with the films of the times, right? This is the evolution of gangster rap, right? NWA, Eazy-E, things of that nature, Dr. Dre, right? So these are the popular culture that the media has given the world as to who Black men are and Black women by default as well, right? So this creates an image of Blackness that should be feared, okay? So this is how this plays out in real time. So this is the white imagination at play, okay? So on the other side of that, we have the maintenance of white innocence. We think about the system of enslavement, right? We're Christians, we believe in the gospel, right? But we're doing this unchristian, inhumane thing to a segment of people, right? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna say that they're heathen. We'll pass the papal bull in, I believe, 1484, which gives us the legal law and the legal jurisdiction to go off into these countries and begin the institution of enslavement under the auspice of civilizing and bringing Christianity to these people, right? So I'm not guilty for rape. I'm not guilty for pillaging. I'm not guilty of murder because I'm doing this under the auspice of God, right? Anybody heard of Manifest Destiny?
Yeah.
So Douglas, can you explain to us what is Manifest Destiny?
It's kind of blurry now, but I believe that like it's our destiny to have that certain thing, basically.
Yes, absolutely. So God gave us the divine right to go out and grab certain lands, right? God gave Christopher Columbus the divine right to come to the Americas and discover America, right? But we're not going to talk about the rape, the pillaging, the murder, the bringing of diseases, right? So this idea of the manifest destiny of the divine right gives them the innocence, right? So it's not a crime because God told me to do it. I'm not inhumane because I'm trying to bring your savage culture to humanity, right? So that maintains my innocence, right? Well, if Breonna Taylor would have not been involved in crime, she wouldn't have gotten shot, right? If George Floyd wouldn't have been doing illegal activity, he wouldn't have gotten choked out. If Michael Brown wouldn't have stolen a blunt, then he would still be alive, right? So all these things justify the inhumane activities of whiteness, and it maintains their innocence. Now, here's how the two pillars intersect. When we have circumstances like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the role of the police is not to be judge, jury, and executioner, right? The role of the police should be able to apprehend you, take you into custody, and then allow you to face a jury of your peers, right? This is how the Constitution says justice works. As a matter of fact, I watched a film yesterday where this white boy stabs the police officer in the neck, all right? Like, don't show him the knife. He literally stabs this motherfucker in the neck, right? A chase ensues. The police officer has his gun drawn. Stop, 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 stop. Gives him 5 commands to stop. The boy doesn't stop running. He puts his gun away, pulls out his taser, and tasers him. And is able to effectively apprehend him, put him in custody, and to take him to jail. Now, mind you, he's a white boy, right? Tamir Rice is a 16-year-old kid I think he was even younger than 16, playing with a toy gun, right? Arrived within the scene within 6 seconds and open up shoot shots, right? So where's the difference? I have the wherewithal to tell you, after you to stab me in my neck, right? Attempted murder. I have the wherewithal to tell you to stop. I have the wherewithal to put my gun away. I have the wherewithal to grab my taser, right? But for some reason, when black bodies are involved, when brown bodies are involved, all that logic goes out the window, right? I grabbed my gun when I meant to grab my taser in the light of Oscar Grant, right? That's what they said. I meant to tase him, but I grabbed my gun instead and I shot him, right? On two separate sides of your hip, the feel of a gun and the feel of a taser is drastically different, but all that logic goes out the window. Why is that, right? So then this idea of I feared for my life comes to the forefront, right? And this is what they always say in these circumstances. He made me fear for my life. It could be a 16-year-old girl. It could be someone in handcuffs. It could be 4 of y'all, 1 of them, right? You have a vest, you have tactical gear, you have a gun, a baton, pepper spray, taser, etc., right? But this person's unarmed. So why is the fear logical, right? Has anybody heard the term never bring a knife to a gunfight, right? So in that logic, right, in that understanding, it does not make sense for the person with the knife to even engage somebody with the gun because the person with the gun has the upper hand, right? This is what that saying is indicating. So all of a sudden, these people who are unarmed, these people are in handcuffs, present this fear to the armed person that makes it justifiable to take their life, right? So what happens is that homicide now becomes what justifiable homicide, right? That's what they call it, and that's what they say that allows these people to get off, right? And what justifies the homicide is the white imagination's unregistered or unnatural or or just fabricated idea of fear of blackness, right? This is something that they created in their mind, right? So the fear of blackness makes the homicide justifiable, and with it being justifiable, the people who commit the crime, who are white, are now innocent, right? So now you see the white imagination coming into play with the maintenance of white innocence, and this structure of white inferiority is upheld, right? Amber Geiger gets a very minimal charge, right? All the police in the Breonna Taylor situation gets let off the hook, right? So again, the white imagination makes the fear justifiable, which allows for society to say, well, nah, they should be innocent. So when we're dealing with Baldwin, these notions of the white imagination and the maintenance of white innocence become paramount. And when you read through the text and you read through the short story, you see these white imagination and the maintenance of innocence play out. So then another thing that I really picked up on was the anti-Black terrorism that is coupled with the over-sexualization of the Black body, right? So the way that the terror that's affected on the Black body is intersected with the sexualization of the Black body, right? Thinking about the way that, and again, as it pertains to the sexualization of the Black body, Jesse mentioned how when he had, wanted a little bit more from his wife that she was willing to put out, he would take his trip to the Black side of a town and arrest, colored women and perform sexual acts with them, right? So again, the sexualizing of the Black body. This notion of subversion. So in last week's reading, we talked about in the story of the bear and the lion, how they were used, their smarts to outwit those with power over them, right? This plays out also in this story where Jesse feels like, well, they like me. And he says on page 20, where a lot of them say, well, yes, Master Jesse, yes, sir, right? So because of this, he thinks that, they have a good rapport. But in reality, they're just telling him these things so he could think that they have a good rapport, but they're undermining his authority and they're circumventing his authority. And you see that come into play with the boy who Jesse's beating in the cell, right? And then the talking about the little boy in the cell. He tells Jesse, my grandmother's name is, what he said his name was. Julia Blossom, right? And you're going to learn to call us by our full name. And then he tells them, you know, we're going to sing you into insanity. So that made me think, what is the significance of the song? And then the multiple interpretations of the song, right? So there's a certain part where Jesse's like, well, they're singing these songs to their God, and they're singing these songs for their salvation. And maybe they're singing the songs for our salvation as well, because that's the feeling that he got when he looked into their eyes, right? But then there's another translation from the boy in the cell that says, nah, fuck that. I ain't singing for your salvation. I'm singing to drive you insane, right? This is the design of these songs, right? So these songs and what Baldwin is doing with these songs is something of importance. And then this idea, you see the idea of white innocence coming out to play on page 236, where he talks about really as it pertains to the song. And he says, you know, Jesse thought he was a good person. No, let me go back. Jesse never thought about being a good person, but he assumed he was a good person, right? So think about that. How if you never put any real thought about you being a good person, how can you just assume that you're a good person, right? That's like saying, I never thought about playing basketball, but shit, I'm assuming I'm a pretty good basketball player, right? That shit, that don't make sense. That's illogical. But this is a way to maintain my innocence, right? So we've read how Jesse is brutalizing people in cells, right? We read how Jesse uses his nightstick as a way to influence his power, right? But he can assume that he's a good person, the maintenance of white innocence. So this idea of a picnic, right? And then the historical significance of a picnic. I don't know if you guys know this, but the original origin of picnic is to pick a nigger and hang him, right? That's what picnic means. And that's when they said in this origin, we're going on a picnic is what was described in this text, right? The whole town going out to view this happening, right? This is what we have when we're talking about picnics. And then they say it's like a 4th of July picnic, right? So think about what that means. The country's Day of Independence is celebrated with the hanging of a black body. This notion of fear, right, as it pertains to explosions, Jesse says, you know, you would hear explosions throughout the night, and they would pray that the wrong hands didn't get on the explosives, right? So essentially, I know that white folks are blowing up black property, but we pray that black hands don't get a hold of these explosives and place them in white spaces, right? So there's a fear there. And I would also say it's an illogical fear, right? Because the reality of that happening is highly unlikely. I don't know if you guys picked up on Jesse's friend Otis, his childhood friend, right? And he mentioned how Otis, in times like this, he would always go to Otis to ask questions. And Otis would be the one that would be able to inform him on things about race that his father or mother wouldn't typically tell him. So to me, that got me thinking, implicitly, this says something about race relations as it pertains to parent and child, right? So Otis's parents are informing him about things as it pertains to race that Jesse's parents aren't informing him. Hence, Jesse would have to go to ask Otis for answers to certain questions, right? So there's conversations that's going on in the black household about race that aren't going on in the white household about race. When you think about the video we watched last week with Ryan Coogler, and he talks about the conversations that go on in black household that says, you know what, you're black in America, right? And he says that these are conversations for the survival of the child, right? And you see that play out with Otis and Jesse. Otis's parents are telling him these things because they need him to survive, right? Where Jesse's parents has the luxury of not telling him certain nuances about what they do because his survival doesn't depend on it, right? But Jesse is very attentive to how the black culture moves, right? He notices he hasn't seen Otis in the past 2 days. He notices as he's driving to the picnic, all the people from the black side of town, they're not on the street, they're inside their homes, right? The black side of town seems quiet and dead, right? Why is that? It's something that Jesse's attentive to. Okay, and then back to this notion of the picnic. He says on page 2245, it was like millions were attended, if not millions, hundreds of thousands at least, right? So think about that. This is a whole town attending this picnic, right? And it's attended like it's a sporting event, right? It's something, and what his dad tells him, right? This is something that you'll never forget, right? So this is something that's passed down from generation to generation. Jesse mentions how the men at this picnic were his role models who taught him how to be men, right? They were his father's men, his father's friends. So you see how this institution of anti-Black thinking and white inferiority is passed down from generation to generation. And then this idea that Jesse asked, he didn't ask it verbally, but he questioned in his mind, well, what did he do? What did the Black man do, right? And to me, again, this notion of white innocence, because he had to do something, right? It cannot be that these people are so pathological that they just have to string up Black bodies for entertainment, right? He had to do something wrong to deserve that. So implicitly what that does, it maintains this notion of their innocence. And then, have you ever heard of the Oedipus complex? So the Oedipus complex is a Greek mythology. It's something that was picked up by Freud, the psychologist, and it says that there's a suppressed desire for a man to have sexual relations with his mom, right? Weird. This is the theory, this is the complex. But we see this play out in the story, because as he's on his father's shoulders, as the body is being burned, as the body is being castrated, he looks over at his mom, sees a strange look in her, right? But at the same time, he realizes that to him, he's never seen his mother more beautiful than at that moment, right? So think about how that pertains to how the story starts off for Jesse, how he's able to end the story, and how it relates to this idea of the Oedipus complex. Also, in that very same scene, he describes he felt a bond with his father that he's never felt before, right? So again, the passing down of these traditions of white inferiority. All right. And then this idea of, on page 248, he says, the crowd finished what the fire did not, right? So they burned him, they castrated him, right? And then, so I don't know if you guys know, but historically at these picnics, what would happen is when they begin to disembody the Black body, right? So they would cut off a hand, somebody would take a hand home. They'll cut off a foot, somebody would take a foot home. Cut off an arm, somebody would take an arm home, and these would be souvenirs. And what would happen, so when there's a certain point of time when folks would die, like in the South, and they would leave their estates, people would go in and kind of like excavate the estates for, things that may be left in the basement. And what would be found would be body parts from those who attended these picnics and would receive the souvenirs, right? Oftentimes as well, the images from these picnics would be distributed like postcards, right? So you would take a picture of the hanging and then we'll send it out to our families across the nation as a postcard, just to show, what's going on in our town, okay? And then, so with that, it's this idea of spectacle, right? Has anybody heard of the term a spectacle lynching? Okay. Does anybody know what a spectacle is? What's the significance of the term spectacle? What is that meant to do?
Isn't it when you're not too sure of them, so the person isn't easily convinced?
Yes. So, right, we're going to make a show of it, right? We're going to make a public presentation of this so the whole town can view it, right? And this spectacle has two purposes. One, so the whites could come out and celebrate and have their picnic and get their souvenirs. And then two, right, to show those in the Black community, if you step out of line, this is your fate, right? So think about in our society today, right? What made the George Floyd situation such a mass movement? What made it such a global phenomenon? Why is that? Rodney King. Why was Rodney King so popular, right? What is the technology that made this phenomenon such a vast phenomenon?
Social media.
Social media, right? The ability to capture it on film, right? That's what made it a worldwide movement. So what happens is captured on film, and what do? You share it, right? Think about what a spectacle lynching does, right? It gives the terrorist the souvenir, right? And it gives the terrorized the fear and places them back in their place. So if we were to take this concept and apply it to our now, be mindful of how you share these information and these images, right? Because what it does inevitably for those who look like the victim of these images, it produces a terror. It produces a psychological affect. It produces a visceral experience, right? You feel that in your body. So think about how you choose to, one, view those images, right? Especially if you're from the community that's being victimized, that has a psychological effect on your spirit and on your body, right? And then two, be mindful of how you share that with others. Has anybody, so this is gonna lead me to my next and final point. Has anybody heard of the term epigenetics? Has anybody heard of the term post-traumatic slave syndrome? So epigenetics and post-traumatic slave syndrome are kind of married to one another. Post-traumatic slave syndrome, I believe the author of the book her name is Joy DeGruy Tyson, I believe. I could be wrong in the last name, but essentially her thesis is this. For those who are descendants of Africans who have experienced in the enslavements, who experienced enslavement, the trauma of enslavement is passed down to your children's children, right? And it says it can be traced down for 7 generations, right? So the beatings that my great-great-grandfather went through while on the plantation has been transferred to his child, to their child, to their child, to me, which I transfer to my child, which will be transferred to their children, right? The lynchings that were viewed by my great-great-grandfather was passed down to my grandfather, which passed it down to my father, which passed it down to me, which is passed down to my children, right? So the trauma is being registered in your DNA, and as you pass your DNA to your offspring, you're passing that trauma along with the DNA. Does that make sense? Y'all with me on that? So this is the science of epigenetics, right? So typically when epigenetics is discussed, it's always viewed from the prism of those being victimized, right? Hence post-traumatic slave syndrome. I was talking to my fiance and she made like this brilliantly profound point. She said, well, if epigenetics is to be true, we cannot assume that it only works on people of culture, on the victimized. It has to play, in fact, on the victimizer also, right? So white folks is passing some type of trauma or terror in their DNA as well, right? You can't hang people the way that you do and not pass that trauma, or have some type of trauma and then not pass it down, right? You can't beat people with a whip till their flesh rips off their skin repeatedly and not have some type of psychological affect, right? So that gets passed down from generations to generations to generations. For me, when I see videos of these white folks bugging the fuck out because they're being told to put on a mask, I will ask myself, what is the mental capacity that doesn't allow you just to put on a mask for 15 minutes, handle your business and leave the store, right? What psychologically, there's something wrong with you. And I think about the science of epigenetics, right? You're a terrorist and you've been passing terrorism in your DNA for generations and generations and generations. And then to be told to have to do something that don't sit well with your terrorist inclinations, you bug out, right? So what Baldwin is trying to get us to see through this story is that the system of enslavement, the system of racism, the system of white inferiority, absolutely and clearly affects the victims, right? That's obvious. But more importantly, and more drastically, it affects the victimizer, right? You cannot do these type of things and not think you're gonna come out unscathed, right? And what Baldwin is kind of bringing us attention to is this is playing out on a sexual level, right? Because in the beginning of the story, Jesse couldn't handle his business as a man, right? But as he thought back to these atrocities and the way that he was understood to being a white man, he was able to find his manhood, right? And perform his duties with his wife at the end of the story. In fact, he was able to perform him as if he was black, right? Because that's what he said, I'm gonna love you like a nigger, right? And I want you to like it like I'm a nigger. This is what he says in the story, right? So Baldwin is bringing our attention to the psychosis that is being produced through this system of white inferiority. So let's do this with the last half hour we have. We'll jump into our fishbowl. We'll get your guys' thoughts about the reading and we'll call it a day. Again, I believe most of us have fishbowled already. But if you haven't, does anybody want to volunteer to fishbowl? And again, you could talk about what I covered already or just anything that you found of interest in the reading. All right. Janelli, have you fishbowled already?
Yes, I have.
Okay. Melissa, have you fishbowled already?
Yes.
Okay. Precious, have you fishbowled already?
Yeah.
Valeria, you fishbowled already, haven't you? Last week, right? Samantha, have you fishbowled? I'm pretty sure you did, yeah. Has anybody on here not fishbowled? Because if you haven't, you definitely want to get your points.
I don't think I have.
Okay, so we'll have you, Bristol. And then Helena, have you fishbowled already? Helena? Sherilyn, have you fishbowled already?
Yes, I have.
Yeah. Okay. Shit. So Bristol, we'll have you do the one fishbowl and then we'll open up to an overall class conversation and then we'll call it a day from there. So again, Bristol, you could talk about whatever you want or you could use some of the things that I've mentioned already.
I found it a bit disturbing, and then I had to sometimes reread something in order, because I was in disbelief at some of the stuff that was in it.
Can you give
And
an example?
I don't know.
What you found? Like
I just found disturbing how because when he went to the flashback, Jesse was had like a different perspective on like black people, I guess, because he had his friend Otis who he used to play around with. And then all of a sudden after that whole picnic situation, it felt like his mind was like being warped into how his parents and his family, the parents' friends were thinking, I guess. And that like shocked me.
Yeah. Very good point. Anything else, Bristol, that kind of stood out to you?
I just I also felt like how unremorseful he felt like after he was having sexual relationships with the girls, and then all of what he like saw, and it just showed how he tried to like say that, oh no, it was like fine, it wasn't like my fault, like there's nothing wrong with me, it's obviously something wrong with them. And I just thought like I got angry, I guess.
Yeah. And you bring up a good point as it pertains to this idea of white innocence, right? Because he talks about, you know, what's happening in the town. They're organizing around voter registration, right? They're demonstrating for their rights. And Jesse is tasked to stop that activism out. And his rationale is, you know, if they just abided by what the law says, if they just did what, like it says in the Bible, we wouldn't have these problems, right? Some of them are good Negroes, the ones that want to get along with the way of the town, but the other ones who are looking for societal advancement are problems, right? And again, so this places the responsibility off of him and onto the bodies who are trying to advocate for their humanity, right? So again, his rationale allows him to maintain this idea of his innocence, which is a false notion. Other thoughts. So we'll open up to the classroom conversation. If you haven't commented, I would like to hear your thoughts on what you thought about the book, or the story. You thought it was interesting.
Can I go? So what I thought about the reading was, like what Bristol said, it was kind of disturbing towards the end, and it was quite interesting in the beginning because it starts off as him like in the bed with his wife, but he's like kind of like flashbacks, I'm guessing. Like at first, when I first started reading, because I read it twice, because at first I thought I was like tripping, like I wasn't getting it that right. So the second time when I was reading, I was getting a better understanding of how he was thinking, and how like at first he felt bad, like for the black community, kind of, yeah, with his friend Otis. And then when he went to the picnic with his family, that's when the entitlement of white man of him started coming out. And then just like what's going on right now with the police and like police brutality, it's like vice versa. If they were to see a black man hanging a white man, they would think of them more as animals. But white people, they think it's okay, which is like backwards.
Yeah.
If they want people to like respect them, like with all that, like especially with the Karens right now, all over social media with the mask, like just wear the mask. It's not for you, it's for everybody around us.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Let me ask you guys a question. So this book was published in 1948 was first published, right? And it's dealing with the theme of lynching, right? So it seems like this phenomenon of lynching is something of the American past. How long ago do you think the most recent lynching was? If you could guess.
If I remember correctly, I saw something on the news and actually read online. There was one recently, like I believe 2 months ago, 2 to 3 months ago.
This summer, there was like a week of 4 to 5 lynchings this summer. 2 of them were in California, right? So although this may be something that is written of the American past, this is very much prevalent in our present, right? In reality, Ahmaud Arbery's situation is a modern day lynching, right? Like that was a lynch mob that enacted violence on Ahmaud Arbery just for jogging, right? So one, these play out now in a very literal sense, and it has evolved into situations like, George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin. That's another modern day lynching, right? So again, Baldwin's uncanny ability to be prevalent in our present. And again, that was written in 1948, right? And this is applicable in 2020, right? I'm curious to hear you guys' thoughts on the pillars of white inferiority, the white innocence and the white imagination. What do you guys think about that? Do you think it plays out? Do you think it works? Do you think Baldwin's tripping? What y'all thought?
I think it works, and I feel like we see it today because with the whole Black Lives Matter movement, we see people, typically white people, who are saying, well, all lives matter. So that's kind of my process of the, white innocence that we see today.
The perfect example, Cecilia. Like that's the perfect analysis and example of the presence of white innocence, right? Because what All Lives Matter does, it takes away the violence that's been enacted on the Black body that makes it necessary to say this phrase that Black Lives Matter, right? So that is, and then even more bastardly is the idea of Blue Lives Matter. There's no fucking blue life. Like, what is that? Like, you go home, you take your uniform off, right? You choose to be a police officer, right? I can't take this black skin off, right? Like, there's no choice that I have in my epidermis, right? So again, to further undermine this idea of Black Lives Mattering, we come up with the your occupation has more, value than a Black lie. What are some other thoughts of, Baldwin's pillars of white inferiority?
Well, I actually wanted to share two things, and also in agreement with what you mentioned earlier about the post-traumatic slave syndrome.
Mhm.
So in one of my other courses, we were actually, for an assignment, we had to watch a video of the author,
Okay.
and she actually explains, like in her meeting, she explains about how the same thing, how it's being passed out, and not just with Black people, but with white people as well. And she mentions, for example, like back then with lynchings, like it's incredible to see how people could stand around and not do nothing. And she shows these pictures of children that were in the area, and they were smiling and like playing around. And she mentions, like, today, like if she were to step on a puppy in front of everyone, nobody would be able to look at that, or they will turn away, and it will be too disturbing for children. So how is lynching not disturbing for these young white children? So that's also like they pass that down by allowing their children to see that and respond in that way. And then also I wanted to make a comment about lynching, how like it happens today, like we've heard stories about it today. And I think it's amazing too, because in that same class, he let us know that in court, they actually have a different definition for lynching. And he gave us an example. This girl, she was being taken into custody for no reason at the park, and her friend grabbed her arm and told her, "Let's go." The police filed against her and said that the friend lynched her away from custody. And she was actually like put into jail.
So just not to cut you off, I know you have some other points, but this is a very good point, bro. Yeah. Like, so if you guys, even most recently, right, if you're watching the protests and you see somebody being apprehended and you'll see like their friends try to pull them away from police custody, that would be considered a lynching, right? That's on the books what a lynching is considered. And you can receive time for that, right? That's a criminal act. So think about the psychology of that. Think about the maintenance of white innocence from a structural level, that we're going to take a term that is specified to the killing of Black bodies, right? And we're going to use that as a term that is going to provide a defense mechanism for police terrorism. Like, if that is not insane, I can't I can't think of another bigger contradiction and just example of the falsities of this society, right? But go ahead, Valeria.
That was pretty much everything else. And they also mentioned the same thing about lynching, how they have a different definition for kidnapping as well. Kidnapping doesn't necessarily mean like what we believe it is, but in the court, it's just as long as you move a person a couple feet from where they're standing, that's considered kidnapping.
Yep. And I think too, that speaks also to the importance of knowing laws, right? Because in all intents and purposes, you're at a rally, you're at a protest, and you're just trying to look out for your friend's best interests, right? And you're just trying to pull them out of a situation that could lead them into harm and very realistically lead them into death, right? Because a lot of people don't make it out of those circumstances, Sandra Bland. But for you doing that is putting you in a situation to where you could be harmed, because now you broke the law, right? And so what you'll notice to circumvent that, they'll start doing like circular blockades. So they'll put their bodies in place in a circle around that individual to prevent them from being apprehended. Also, I think a brilliant tactic of Black Lives Matter is the way that they use white bodies for Black lives. So that's a fragment of their movement. It's called White Bodies for Black Lives. So when these type of altercations arise between a Black body and the police, the white person will step in and intervene and act as that shield. And you'll be surprised on how quick that is able to diffuse a situation just by the presence of a white body. So that's a very good point, Valeria. I would like to get a couple more thoughts on the Baldwin's pillars of white inferiority. So Precious, what do you think about this idea of the pillars of white inferiority, white innocence, and the white imagination? Precious? Melissa, how about you? What are your thoughts about the white imagination or the maintenance of white innocence?
For me, I think during the beginning, how he talks about how he sees the way they live, and how for him it's disturbing the presence of them being around, or seeing how they live, or their actions, or even the way like they can walk. And to me it's like they see it as disturbing when it should just be seen as, you know, people in help, and how they're below them because they're not receiving help, and they're seen as different instead of just in poverty. And to me that was like, it's sad because it made me think, well, they're not helping out, they're just seeing them as disgusting instead of saying, you know, they're people actually in need and they should get help from everybody else, and not seen as like creatures, you know, because even creatures get homes and get attention. So that just made me feel like it wasn't fair.
Yeah, and I think to Valeria's point, right, creatures get treated better than black folks, right? Because you, like Michael Vick went to jail for a hell of a long time for his little dog ring, and all of these police officers did no jail time. So clearly there's more value on an animal than there is in the black body in this circumstance. But also, which your point brought up for me, Melissa, is while he's defiling black culture and black experiences, right? He wants to have sex with black women, right? He wants to be able to have sex as if he's a black man, right? So it's this funny envy that is present in this system of white inferiority, right? It's this desire that they have to be possessive of certain elements of blackness, right? If you think about the way they describe the castration scene, right? And I think Baldwin's being a little bit flippant in the way that he described it, right? Just the boy describing the size of it, right? I think that's a little bit of a play on Baldwin's part, but there's something to that, right? Again, it goes into this over-sexualization of the black body. There's a psychiatrist from Martinique by the name of Frantz Fanon, and he has this whole book called Black Skin, White Mass, and he says that racism for the white man and the black man plays out at a sexual level, right? In the sense that the white man is intimidated and envious about the black man's sexual abilities, right? So he says through this context, all phobias stem from a repressed sexual desire, right? So the fear of the black body stems from a repressed sexual desire around blackness, right? Think about how, even if I'm giving, well, that's not a good example, but think about how many black men are put in jail because white women falsely accuse them of rape, but only because they wanted consensual sexual relations with that individual, they get caught and now he raped me, right? So again, this is a repressed sexual desire that they have that society won't let them to give into. Think about Jesse himself, right? When he wasn't able to perform his duties, he thought about when he was having hard times, he would typically go into the black side of the town and get those sexual acts done, right? Thomas Jefferson. Why is Thomas Jefferson important in this conversation? Why would I bring his name up?
Because he used to have sexual relationships with slaves.
So while he's writing the Constitution and all that beautiful sounding bullshit, he's oppressing black women, right? He has a whole slave community in his home, and he's impregnating the black women who he's enslaving, right? Repressed sexual desires. So according to Fanon, all phobias in the context of the black and white relations stem from this repressed sexual desire. Give me some last thoughts on the book and we'll close it out. Cecilia, what do you think about the reading?
Like everybody else, I had a hard time reading it. You know, it was really horrifying, you know, to see this new perspective, but also, I guess, insightful because previously we've been seeing it through the Black man's perspective, and now to see it through the white man's perspective, it's making a lot more sense. And even with today, how you were saying, how, you know, white people refuse to wear the mask, it doesn't make sense, but kind of comparing those two with the reading to now, it makes a lot more sense why we see the things we see today. And also with the example I brought up, how, you know, with the white innocence, how they want to say, oh, you know, all lives matter. It's just like, dude, shut up, this ain't about you.
Yeah.
You know,
About you. Yeah, good point. Yaneli, give us some thoughts about the book.
So I agree with everyone, you know, basically everyone summarized the thoughts that I had, but I also think that it's just like insane how it explains like the story of what he did, and like how it affected like others around him too. So maybe like in the future, like people could like look back at it and see, you know, how life was back then, and like they could also like be inspired to, you know, not do like the same or something, or not like judge people because of how they look or what they are. Or maybe sometimes people like could also learn from their mistakes. But I am a firm believer that, you know, people do what they want to do, but sometimes they're not like right from what they think.
Yeah, and I think one thing to pay attention to is the fact that this is passed down from generation to generation, right? So it makes sense as to why we're still dealing with these problems in today, because these things continue to be passed down. But at the same time, I don't want to let society and culture off the hook and say that it's just the parents who are informing these people on how to behave this way, because that's not the truth, right? There's this book called The First R, and with the books is a case study on students from preschool to first grade, right? And the authors are studying how these children perform racism, right? And what will happen is a racist circumstance will come on campus. The parents are brought in to let them know what their child said or did. The first thing that the parents say is, well, they didn't learn that at our house, right? They must have got it from a neighbor down the street, or they must have picked it up here at school, right? So it's this idea that racism is a learned behavior, right? But she's saying that that's not the case. Racism is a societal condition, right? So very well, it could be true that this child didn't learn those behaviors from you inside the home, but they watch TV in a racist society, right? They play video games in a racist society. They're conditioned in a racist society. So already they're coming out informed on how to perform racism, right? So what she's arguing is that although white parents are in some circumstances aren't teaching their children how to be racist, what they're not doing is informing them on how to be anti-racist, right? So for them, we don't talk about race in our home. So that's their way of not creating racist, right? So while they're not talking about it in the home, everything else in society is informing them about how to perform racism. So they don't have a concrete way on how to combat these ideals, right? So this is the argument that's being made in the book, The First R. Also, to take it back to Frantz Fanon, he has a chapter called Racism and Culture. And he says, really, the product of racism is produced through exploitation, through a culture of exploitation, and culture within itself, right? So we are a capitalist society in America, right? So the ability to produce profit, and the production of the profit goes to the minority wealthy, right? So if you're not a minority wealthy person, I don't mean a minority as in a person of color. That's not how I mean it. I mean like the 1% who owns the world's wealth, right? I mean, so if I work for Apple, not Steve Jobs, but what's his name? The new Tim Cook. He is that 1%, right? So that money that I work and I earn while working there is really going to make him rich, right? So my labor becomes exploited. So what happens is in a culture of exploitation, racism evolves to match the level of exploitation. And it evolves in a way so that the victims of racism can't quite put their finger on what the racism is doing and how they're being victimized by the racism. And by the time that we figure it out as the victims of racism, the culture of the society has evolved the racism another step to make it more harder for us to pinpoint, right? So it's not the parents teaching this solely that is perpetuating these racist ideas. We are in a culture, in a society that is racist, right? So if we really want to address this race issue, we have to address society as a whole and have to think about ways of producing new forms and new ways of relating and new types of societies, because the one that we exist in will always perpetuate racism. Any last thoughts? Questions, comments? Go ahead.
I thought it was interesting how Baldwin really examined the racial oppression during that time through the viewpoint of Jesse and his like typical white attitude in sort of this like Jim Crow manner where like the black man is seen as a threat, and how the insecurity and like fear of like the racist white person is felt and still is like is like still today, and like losing their power and dominance. I don't know if that made sense, but
no, it does. You're absolutely right. And to me, and if I look at the way I make sense of white inferiority today is like if you go to the beach, right, and you pick up sand and you try to hold the sand in your hand, it's going to fall through the cracks of your hand. And this is the current state of white inferiority in our world today. They're trying to hold on to this power that's the sand that's leaking through their hands, and they're scrambling. And that's why individuals like Trump become so popular, because he makes them reminiscent of a time when they were able to hold the sand in their hand, right? But that time is gone. So far as